Hi, I'm Erik Kieser. You're about to see a sample of one of the presentations I do for organizations and businesses around the country. If you like what you see and you'd like to talk to me about this presentation or any of the other topics I address in presentations, please make contact with me with the information you'll find at the end of this video. Thank you.
All right, so today I'm going to talk about a crucial definition that's going to set the tone for this entire presentation. Many of us think that the opposite of anxiety is fearlessness, or some folks might say courage. I'm going to contend today that the opposite of anxiety is agency. I'll explain agency a little more fully as I move through this presentation. But the bottom line is this: we're either reacting to the world out of a sense of anxiety, that is, we don't feel like we can deal with what's happening to us, or we're coming at it with a sense of agency, a confidence, a sense of can-do-itness, an ability to take on what's in front of us. So today I'm going to talk about the origin of anxiety, which is in fact thinking. There's a lot of debate about that. I'll get more into detail with that in a minute. I'm going to say that anxiety in our thinking starts with what-if thinking, conjecturing about the future and almost invariably expecting the worst to happen. We're going to treat it as a crisis. This anxiety thinking over time corrodes our sense of agency. As I mentioned earlier, on that spectrum, we're either moving towards anxiety or moving towards agency. If we're trying to solve the future that we're projecting as a crisis, we are over time corroding that sense of agency. The great news is anxiety can be rewritten. That habitual anxious thinking can be identified, addressed, and changed with practice and effort. And of course, as we do that, we begin to move back towards a sense of agency. Here's a dictionary definition. It's a good one. And I want to add to it, it's also a sense of capacity, and it's a sense of the ability to exert power in that situation. It's going to require clarity on where we're doing what-if thinking, and it's going to mean shifting literally from crisis to problem in our thinking. All right, so we're living in anxious times. It's not hard to see that around us. There's a lot of reasons for it. We've said COVID in today's presentation, but in fact, it's touching a lot of different areas. Economic concerns, physical health concerns, of course, fears of being isolated. One of the phrases that triggers for me a lot of this verbal concern is the use of the phrase the new normal. One of the things anxiety will tempt us to do is to try to get control of things, lock things down, either by defining them or getting our arms around them in some definitive way. But what's really happening is we're reacting from worry and stress. We're making ourselves anxious as we have the sense that we don't have any agency in a particular fear or situation. You hear the word control a lot when people talk about their fears. It's something you don't hear people with a sense of agency in that same situation say. Control is a clue that people are wrestling with anxiety. There are some broad misunderstandings about anxiety that really contribute to our inability to deal with anxiety effectively. One of those misunderstandings, and again, there's no malice in any of this, it's simply incomplete models, is that we assume anxiety can be genetic. A disturbingly large number of people think that people are just anxious, they're born that way. That's not true. And certainly the last quarter century has taught us in multiple ways, the research around trauma, the research around how much our thinking impacts our bodies, tells us that anxiety itself isn't genetic. We do have a genetic component to this thing we call flight or fight, the mechanism that keeps us safe in the presence of real danger. But that's worlds away from anxiety being genetic. There's also a little bit of confusion because a lot of us don't understand that we learn this, and I'll get more into that in a couple of minutes. But in effect, we learn to think certain ways, and we learn it very early. There's also a misperception that anxiety is somehow neurological, that we've taken damage or there's some permanent condition in the brain. Again, it's not true. We can be more sensitive to stimuli than some of the folks around us. We can also have, well, smarts. Bright people are the ones that are most likely to suffer from anxiety. But none of that means that you're doomed to have it forever. There's nothing organic in this. Like I said a moment ago, these are incomplete models driven from an earlier attempt to understand where anxiety comes from and what to do with it. There's one more component. There tends to be an adult resistance in the culture in general to talk about anxiety directly and clearly. We tend to treat that as weakness or see it as a personal failing. This is probably especially true in business, but it tends to be a trait in adults in general. Yet the one thing we don't want to do is act as if anxiety was something shameful or taboo. What we really want to do is get clear that this is happening in our thinking. And we have to understand that we learn to think that way over time. Now, without throwing any stones and not blaming anybody's family, we can say that families are a primary source of learning anxious thinking. Often that learning is even pre-verbal. As we listen to our parents and our siblings and our uncles and aunts talk, we're beginning to absorb the thinking that made them anxious, and in turn, all unawares, we can learn to thinking that same way. Our communities, of course, generate sources of anxiety, things as various as school or church. Of course, our personal experience contributes to that, especially building on the foundation of that earlier training from family and community. There's lots of ways we can talk about learned anxiety. One of my favorite is my mother, a woman who was very bright, very capable, and who taught school for 41 years. But during that entire time, never overcame her fear of snakes. Now, as far as we could tell from conversation, my mother was never attacked by a cobra or a giant anaconda. She had simply learned over time to be afraid of snakes. She saw dozens or even hundreds, all those showroom days in her classroom, kids would bring snakes to share, and she never got over it. But the truth is, there was no danger in any of the snakes she saw, and she had never been confronted with a dangerous snake. She had simply learned to think anxiously about that particular issue. One more time, that training often comes early. It's unintentional on the people that are training us, and before we have any control over that thinking coming into us. Why is that important? Well, because everybody has anxiety. It's not a thing that we're trying to get rid of. It's part of the natural mechanism we have to stay safe. And at the same time, we don't want to shut down anxiety's messages. It's trying very hard to point us back to that anxious thinking so we can do something about it. It's really trying to keep us safe from the things that scare us, whether it's real danger, which is 99% of the time not the case with anxiety, or it's the thinking that makes us anxious. In a very real sense, anxiety is trying to tell us that we've lost or that we're losing a sense of agency. In some respects, it's almost our most powerful ally in helping us begin to move back towards regaining that sense of agency. We just have to get some clarity on where we lost agency in the first place. So how does this process work? Thankfully, it's not complex. Anxiety starts with a thought. Now, I have to qualify something almost immediately, but it starts as a thought in reaction to something we're experiencing or thinking or moving through. But having said that, it's also a thought that's probably been habituated, whether it was 2 days ago or decades ago. I want to establish the notion of habitual thought. Now, anytime we have a situation, we have two ways to respond to it. We can treat it as a problem, which means we're not going to get anxious, period. Or we can treat it as a crisis. That is, we can be afraid of the things that might happen if we don't deal with it as a crisis. So what is a crisis? Well, we have to answer that question biologically. If you're an antelope on the African veldt and you're minding your own business, eating grass or drinking water, you're in problem-solving mode. But if you smell lion, your brain's going to kick into crisis mode. And you have one mission: to get away from it. Because if you don't, it's going to kill you. Crisis biologically means literally life or death. Anything else we're dealing with is a problem. Now, unfortunately, as human beings, we can learn to treat anything as a crisis. The IRS, clowns, non-dangerous snakes, just as some examples. If you can imagine it, if you can think it, humans can learn to be afraid of it. So if we start treating something as a crisis, we run the risk of activating flight or fight. You may more commonly hear this as fight or flight. I've reversed that because in truth, our first impulse is to run. And only when we can't run do we fight. So I now flip that to flight or fight. Flight or fight evolved to keep us safe in the presence of real danger, like that antelope on the African veldt. If, like I've already said, we experience a crisis moment, we tell ourselves a thing is scary, our first impulse is to get away from it. We want to get as far away from it as we can because that's a great survival strategy in the natural world. If we can't escape, and only if we can't escape, then anger kicks in because our mission is now to fight. I want to qualify that also by saying we want to fight until we can get back to running away. So first impulse is to run, second impulse is to fight. There's a third place we can reach in this, and this is all too common these days. We can become overwhelmed. We can get so unable to run or fight that we finally just freeze in place. And I would call that an overwhelm reaction. I want to give an example. You can be in an office situation and suddenly someone comes at you and criticizes the work you've done. Your first impulse, largely unconsciously, is to want to get out of that situation. But you can't just run out of the room normally. So now you get defensive and you begin to push back on the coworker. Let's say you get into a struggle and then your boss jumps in and starts to critique your work as well. You can at that point be overwhelmed and don't know what to do. You can't run, you can't fight, you freeze in place. Just one tiny example. So what happens is we have a situation, problem, whatever it's going to be, and we're treating it as a crisis. When that problem or issue surfaces, we're going to keep trying to, unfortunately, solve it as a crisis. That's an anxiety response. Probably one time in 100 that's going to work. It certainly works often enough that we're tempted to keep doing it. But 99% of the time, we can't solve it as a crisis. Let me give you another example. I've known someone in my life who for 5 years in a row didn't file their taxes for a variety of reasons. They had begun to treat the IRS as a crisis. They worried about it, they agonized over it, they thought about robbing a bank, semi-sarcastically, but they couldn't fix it as a crisis. There was nothing to run from, and there was really nothing to fight. Only when they began to shift this back to, okay, what can I do? They called the IRS, they had a conversation with the tax guy there, and that person said, well, you first got to file your taxes. Then the solution began to come. But they could not and they would not solve that as a crisis. If you're in crisis resolving mode, you can get lost in a loop. You keep trying to solve it over and over again. This is a dangerous cycle and begins to lead to some of the worst outcomes of anxiety because we're what-ifing ourselves into a corner. All we can see is how bad things can get. There's a crucial thing to understand here. Flight or fight, in its efforts to try to resolve this crisis, keeps imagining worst-case scenarios. And as it's doing that, it's both scaring the crap out of us and it's activating itself again and again, flight or fight, but we're going nowhere. We have the sense that we're becoming helpless. That's deadly because over time, our flight or fight reaction is amplifying this treatment of this issue as a crisis. We all know what flight or fight can do to us. We get that tightness in our chest and the clench in our stomach, and all of a sudden we're sweating. These are just some of the physical responses. We have a host of emotional ones. We're angry, we're scared, we're embarrassed, we feel guilty, we're crying or nervously laughing. And of course, mental things happen too. Disorientation, stuttering, which is entirely a psychological response, lack of ability to recall things or summon data when you need it. All of that's in the backwash of flight or fight as it's constantly gearing up to get us away from danger. This can strengthen that feedback loop, and now it's becoming a nicely ingrained habit. Let me remind you again, that there's only two ways to respond to a situation biologically, really neurologically. We can treat it as a problem and we skip all of this stuff, or we treat it as a crisis and habituate ourselves into that crisis response. Lots of us over time can make flight or fight the enemy. We even lose sight of the thing, the original thinking that scared us, and now all we can see is flight or fight activating again or again, which in turn can leave us flinching from that response. We're far enough away from the actual thinking that we're doing almost anything to get away from that really uncomfortable flight or fight reaction. One of the things that can help us is that we can start learning that flight or fight is simply an alarm system. It's only there to prepare us to get out of danger. And in this case, with our thinking, there's not even any danger. It is trying to, again, point us back to the thinking that's scaring us in the first place. Worst of all, to bring this crisis loop thinking to a conclusion, we can habituate that thinking. That thinking becomes semi or subconscious. It's back there harassing us and making our lives miserable, but we're not aware of it. We're not conscious of that process. There are so many things in our lives that are habitual. Here's just two examples. Driving a car, terribly complex set of behaviors and activities that are largely or even mostly unconscious, or brushing our teeth. We can become conscious of them, but it takes some effort and time, a little bit of work to get into that habit and interrupt it and do something about it to change it. Final point in this loop of anxious thinking. Over time, as I mentioned early in this presentation, we can corrode our sense of agency We would technically call that learned helplessness. We can teach ourselves that we're helpless in the face of this issue. A small example from my own life, for most of my life, I have told myself I can't cook. I have tried some aborted efforts, I've made a mess of things, and unaware to myself, I told myself I'm helpless in the kitchen. That may sound funny for a 60-year-old guy, but in fact, it's exactly how I thought. Only in the last few months have I begun to learn with the help of my partner that in fact, I do have some agency in the kitchen. I may never be Anthony Bourdain, but I can say with confidence that I now have a beginning sense of agency in the kitchen. I'm unlearning that learned helplessness. But if we don't do some effort in that direction, we feel like we can't find resolution, this whole thing is happening in the background. We're anxious, we're not clear why we're anxious, we're having a flight or fight surface, we're pinned, and we have a sense of helplessness. All right, I don't want to minimize, by the way, the discomfort of flight or fight. For a lot of us, it's very scary. Scary enough to want to find professional help, scary enough to want to medicate so we feel better. Flight or fight is strong. We can get to a place where we just don't want to think about it and push it away. And even that pushing away becomes a habit. All right, having said that, what can we do about this? Thankfully, it's not complicated. And in fact, can move pretty rapidly if we're willing to lean in and do a little bit of work. We want to shake free of habitual anxious thinking. The mission, as always, is to begin to gain a sense of agency around this issue or problem that we've told ourselves for a long time we have no agency with. Step one is to identify where we're doing that anxious what-if thinking. And why are we treating this as a crisis? That may take a little thought, but at the end of the day, we want to start questioning why this thing is a crisis. The IRS, non-dangerous snakes, clowns, being in the kitchen, all of these things are actually problems and not life or death crises. Another question to ask is, where do we think we lack agency about this thing? Why does this thing have a feeling or a sense of a lack of agency? Even these first two questions can begin to force this out of crisis thinking into problem thinking. One client, and of course I say a client's experience here, but actually I taught public speaking for years in the community college system in Northern California. And I can tell you that at least half of the college kids that came to my class were terrified of speaking. But I'm pointing out a specific client I had who was already a CEO and was terrified to get up in front of an audience. The interesting part was, as we began to identify why he was making this a crisis, he was able to say, well, I'm afraid of being laughed at. I'm afraid they're going to think I'm stupid. Those two fears and the extrapolations thereof, being mocked, being derided, being dismissed, losing his job, and most of us recognize that process. As he began to get clear on that, he was able to begin to shift public speaking from crisis to problem. He had reactions and it scared him, but it also began to give him a sense of agency. I have other consulting colleagues who have been terrified of marketing and see it as a thing they're helpless against. I've experienced this myself. Same thing. How do we unpack that from crisis, largely unconsciously, largely running away from how we feel on this topic, to being present for it and doing something about it? So, at the beginning of this process, like I've already said, it may only be peripherally aware. We have a profound sense of discomfort, but we couldn't point out a specific thought. That will come with a little time and effort, but at the beginning, it may not be instantly clear why we're anxious about this thing. Journaling and conversation with people that know us are a great place to start as we begin this kind of small introspective journey towards understanding our thinking. Things that we get defensive about or avoid entirely are also excellent clues to point to things that we've pushed away and out of our conscious thinking. Asking people around us, coworkers and supervisors, even people that we just work with, can be a great way to begin to identify what's going on with that fear. A coach or a therapist can be extremely helpful, especially if we're starting to get a handle on it and we're having a hard time with those flight or fight reactions. The more clearly and precisely we can shift our thinking from crisis to problem, the faster this work is going to go. At the same time, it's going to take a little effort. Self-awareness is not enough. It's the beginning of it and being able to identify it clearly, but it's not enough to identify just the thinking. We have to also begin to change it. It wasn't enough for me to realize that I felt helpless in the kitchen. I actually had to get into the kitchen and do something about it, begin to make an effort. We can say with confidence that what's really happening is between the identification and the work, we're beginning to overwrite that old program, that old piece of thinking that's been making us feel anxious in the first place. Doing that along with taking action is going to make this move very quickly out of crisis. I've said this now at least twice in this presentation. It's important to repeat it. We're going to get pushback. We're going to be uncomfortable, and especially at the beginning, it's going to be very tempting to put it off, rationalize away why we're not addressing it. But the only real progress comes from some steady work in this direction. It's partly just because of flight or fight, but it's also because changing thinking habits takes time. We will not instantly shift a thought. A lot of people talking about this talk about being in a groove, like a wagon in a groove. You have to keep bumping yourself up out of that groove, especially at the beginning, to start to carve new grooves. And groove isn't a bad word for a habit. We really do make neurons into pathways that are strengthened or weakened. We're strengthening new pathways and diminishing old strong ones in our habitual anxious thinking. And we've also developed habits of avoidance. It's not just the thinking, but the habit of avoiding that thinking in the first place. Bottom line, it's going to feel like danger. It's going to be uncomfortable. At some points, it might even feel excruciating, but those sensations are temporary, and with practice and time, we can even learn to be comfortable, as crazy as it sounds, with flight or fight. Remember, at the end of the day, we're reframing crisis thinking as problem thinking, and the ultimate mission is to get to a sense of agency. One of the exciting parts of this work is even a little bit of movement in that direction can begin to feed the flame of agency. We've already begun to work on understanding where we've misidentified the issue. And in the identifying, we're already beginning to get a sense of agency. There may not be anything worse than having something plague us and we can't tell ourselves what's wrong. Even some of that beginning journal work, discussion work, coaching or therapy work can begin to move this to where we're conscious of what scares us. One great tool is to think about, where do I have a sense of agency? And where can I borrow agency from my life in a place I have it into this place where I don't? There's no adult on earth that has zero agency about their entire lives. People that I've worked with who have fought chronic panic attacks and even agoraphobia still have parts of their lives where they feel very much like they have a sense of agency. That's true for everybody. Another hint is that if we can ask the question, is this a crisis or is this a problem? By definition, it has to be a problem. If you're actually in a crisis, a real life or death scenario, there's no time for that. You're already reacting. It's a kind of a subtle giveaway that even though we're not talking to ourselves about what scares us, our brains are still able to very lucidly say, nah, that's a problem, or yes, this is a crisis. In summary, anxiety is driven by thinking, which is almost always habitual thinking. We have to get clear on where we are and on thinking about what if about the future. And it's that future crisis making that makes us anxious. If we keep at it, keep trying to solve it as a crisis, we're going to corrode our natural sense of agency. The mission is to rewrite that thinking, to shift from anxiety and back towards agency. And it requires some clarity about the precise thinking that we're making ourselves crazy with, that what if thinking in the first place. It takes a little work and time. It's going to be frustrating, but at the end of the day, you can change anxious thinking to agency.